When you think of this shocking news at the moment, Senator McCaskill, you knew him so well, certainly a very well-known name, regardless of whether you supported him or you did not.
Yeah, obviously this is shocking. Obviously, when I think of Lindsey, I think of somebody who had every intention of staying in the Senate for his entire life. And, you know, Lindsey, especially by Senate standards, sometimes was not one of the most elderly of the Senate. So it is shocking. I think what I think is important to remember is how steadfast Lindsey was about the United States military. I mean, he was a former JAG officer. And if you ever watched Lindsey question witnesses, you could tell he'd been in a courtroom. He knew how to get the answers that sometimes witnesses did not want to give in front of the United States Senate, particularly on the Armed Services Committee. We served together on that committee for 12 years, and he was a very, very committed to the United States and our allies. He felt very strongly about supporting Ukraine, very strongly about supporting Israel, very strongly about continuing to make the military as mighty as possible. And yeah, we can find things about Lindsey that are hard to explain. And I watched Lindsey go from somebody who hung out with Joe Lieberman and John McCain, and John McCain kind of was the leader of that pack, and Lindsey was a enthusiastic member of that close friendship. And I think John McCain obviously had problems with Donald Trump. But then, once we lost John McCain, Lindsey gravitated towards Donald Trump and became a close golf buddy of the president. And it was hard sometimes. It was a head scratcher to see some of the positions that Lindsey took, knowing him as I did when I served with him in the Senate. All that aside, this is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for all of his many friends and staff. And say what you will about Lindsey Graham, that he believed in public service, and for that, he should, in fact, be celebrated.
Senator McCaskill, when we look at his travel schedule, we're just showing some video. He just came back from Ukraine, and he arrived just within the last 24 hours. NBC News was reporting that he was then to go on to meet the press. What was the schedule he kept? What was the pace that he typically did have? Was it always packed, as most elected officials, senators like yourself, keep at all times? Was it that sort of schedule?
Yeah, he was a very hard worker. But I will say that probably more so than many senators, he focused most of his overseas travel around our military engagement. Whether it was going to a security conference in Europe, or whether it was going into Afghanistan or Iraq, can't count how many times he made trips into those troubled zones when we had military on the ground there. Various countries in the Middle East, has been, I think, a constant supporter of the Ukraine military, and I think should get some credit. You noticed that Trump changed his attitude slightly about Ukraine at this last NATO meeting that he attended. And Lindsey gets some credit for that. I'm sure Lindsey has been constantly urging the president to support Ukraine and to stop being so kind to Putin. That was the voice, I think, that Lindsey was bringing to that conversation. And obviously, I think that he was in Ukraine trying to drive whatever he could in terms of the decisions that have been made lately by the White House to be more supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah, as we watch more of the video and pictures from, again, Senator Lindsey Graham, as he was just returning from Ukraine after a diplomatic trip there. And as we look at this, Senator McCaskill, that trip is about 20 hours one way. He just arrived back from Ukraine. You can see certainly that he was meeting with many individuals, just based on the pictures that we're seeing right now. And in the reporting over the years, he never had necessarily difficulties medically, at least that were reported throughout the years. And so one might think, and again, you know him better, that he was fairly strong when it comes to Constitution, given his schedule, because there's no reported, if you will, major difficulties medically for him.
No, I have no recollection of Lindsey being anything but fully present for everything. In fact, sometimes too much so. Yeah, his travel schedule was brutal, and because of his commitment to the military. And I think also, recently he has been doing a lot of shuttle diplomacy around the situation with Israel. I mean, he was one of the most strong supporters of what Trump did in Iran. And I think a lot of that was because of his relationship with Israel. And it doesn't surprise me that the Israeli Minister of Defense is already out with a strong statement of grief and sympathy. I think he was somebody who had a very direct line to Bibi Netanyahu and was in constant communication with the powers that be in Israel. He believed that the American military should have been used against Iran the way it was. And frankly, it would not surprise me to think he was pushing for even stronger response to Iran in these weeks where we have gone back and forth with, is there a ceasefire? Isn't there a ceasefire? Is the Strait of Hormuz open? Is it closed? I'm sure that Lindsey was advocating for the military to push further and harder into Iran in order to achieve a military objective. So, I honestly, Richard, I'm shocked about this because I do think maybe it was a sudden heart attack. We don't know at this point, but clearly he was living a life and had a schedule that would not indicate that he had any medical issues he was dealing with.
Right. And part of this, as you were intimating here, Senator McCaskill, is that a good friend of the White House. The White House loses a very good friend in the Senate, a voice of the Senate, somebody that might say was one of the most, if not the most prominent Republican voice in the Senate in terms of having that connection with the White House.
Yeah, and that he that wasn't something that was a given. And this is one of the head scratchers about Lindsey, because there are many things that I worked with Lindsey on when I was in the Senate, particularly in the area of the armed services jurisdiction, and even other things. And Lindsey, it surprised me, frankly, a little that Lindsey became so close to the president, because I think there were things the president did that if Lindsey had some truth serum, he would have been uncomfortable with. But I think he believed that his voice inside the tent was going to be more powerful than his voice outside the tent. And so he worked very hard to get inside that tent, and he remained there, obviously, until this sudden and tragic death.